Fatiha. Selamun Aleyküm. مدد يا رسول مدد يا سادات أصحاب الرسول مدد يا رسول دستور من شاء الله فاز دستور محمد الحكام مدد طريقتنا الصحبة والخير في الجمعية Peygamber Efendimiz sallallahu aleyhi ve sellem buyuruyor.
Our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, says,
İnsan Allah Azze ve Celle'ye mümin nasıl yaklaşır daha
how can a person, how can a believer, a mu'min, come nearer, draw closer to Allah Almighty?
yakın olur diye söyler. İbadetlerini, nafileleri yaparak.
Our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, then says that a believer draws nearer to Allah Almighty and gets closer to Allah Almighty through his worship and through his additional service he performs for the sake of Allah Almighty, for besides completing the obligatory prayers, to also do voluntary worship.
Tabii farzları yapmaları insanların o Allah'ın emri.
To fulfill what is fard is a must, because the fards are the obligations which have been commanded by Allah Almighty.
Olan farzlar, onlar yapılması gereken 5 vakit namaz.
What is fard must be fulfilled, so praying 5 times a day is an obligation which must be fulfilled.
Oruç, zekat, hac.
To fast, to give zakah, to make pilgrimage, these are the obligations which are fard.
Onlar yapılacak.
These must be done.
Dışında nafile dedi, sünnetlerdi.
But besides these, there's additional voluntary worship.
Hep sünnetleri yapmak.
Which is based on the sunnah of our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him.
Ondan sonra vacip olan yani müekket sünnetler var.
There are certain sunnah prayers and there are certain sunnah which is mandatory.
Onlar sabah namazının öğlen, ikindi, sabah, akşam.
So there are mandatory sunnah prayers for Fajr, for Dhuhr, for Asr, for Maghrib.
O müekketlerin dışında nafile olan daha fazla.
But besides these mandatory sunnah prayers during the obligatory prayers 5 times a day, there's also additional worship. There are also additional sunnah prayers which are voluntary.
Mesela öğlen namazının son 2 rekatını 4 rekat.
For example, one can increase the number of worship by, instead of praying 2 rakah during the last sunnah of Dhuhr prayer, one may pray 4 rakah instead, which is sunnah.
Ondan sonra ikindi sünneti akşam evvabinler.
Or for example, after Maghrib prayer, there's Awwabin prayer, which is sunnah and voluntary.
İşrak, kuşluk namazları.
Or there's Salatul Ishraq, Salatul Duha, after Fajr.
Onlar nafile namazlar.
These are additional voluntary worships, sunnah prayers, which are not obligatory.
İsteyen kılar, isteyen kılmaz ama.
And whoever desires may perform these prayers.
Allah Azze ve Celle yaklaşmak isteyen onları daha fazla yapar.
But these are the means to draw nearer and get closer to Allah Almighty.
Ona ne kadar Allah Azze ve Celle'ye yaklaşırsa,
and the closer and the nearer you get to Allah Almighty,
o kadar faydası olur.
There will be more and more benefit for you.
Allah Azze ve Celle hadisi kutsi'de buyuruyor.
Allah Almighty declares in the Hadith Qudsi,
kulum bana nafilelerle yaklaşır.
My servant will draw closer to me through his voluntary additional worship.
O onun daha yaklaştıkça ben onun eli olurum.
And as he draws nearer and gets closer and closer, I will become his hands with which he holds.
Yürüyen ayağı olurum
I will become his feet with which he walks.
diye Allah Azze ve Celle'nin hadisi kutsi dedi. İnsanlara
Thus Allah Almighty describes how to acquire proximity to Allah Almighty and how to get closer and closer to Allah Almighty, and what the effect of getting nearer to Allah Almighty is in this Hadith Qudsi.
Müjde veriyor.
These are glad tidings.
Onun için Allah Azze ve Celle ne kadar yaklaşabilirse, insan ne kadar yapabilirse
Therefore, the closer one can get to Allah Almighty, the more one can do.
Yapması lazım.
One should do it,
Mümin tarikat ehli
especially as believers, as mu'mins, as followers of the tariqah.
yapamadığımı gene de Allah niyetine göre verir.
And even if you are unable to do it, at least you should have the intention to do these additional worships, and Allah Almighty will reward you according to your intentions.
Yapmak isteriz. Bütün sünnetleri, farzları zaten yapıyoruz. Allah
And this is our intention. We want to do all our obligatory worship. Of course, we must do our obligatory worship, and we intend to do all sunnah worship, which is all additional and voluntary.
yardım etsin.
And may Allah Almighty support us in this effort of ours.
Şimdi de çoğu insan namaz kılamıyorum diyor.
There are many people who say, I'm unable to perform my prayers 5 times a day.
Kıldığınca bir şey hal oluyor. O hal şey değil, mazeret değil.
And they say, when I want to pray, I undergo a condition, a state which makes it difficult for me to perform my prayer, and which prevents me from praying. But that condition that you describe, that state you undergo, that should be no excuse for you for missing your prayer 5 times a day.
Mazeret değil, namaz kılmak, farz olan namazı kılmak.
You have to pray, perform your prayers 5 times a day. You have to pray your obligatory prayers.
Her Müslümana Allah'ın emridir.
It is an obligation and it is a command by Allah Almighty to all Muslims.
Onu yapması lazım.
And then the prayers 5 times a day must be performed.
Nasıl hastaysa
If you are sick,
oturarak kılacak.
you may perform your prayer 5 times a day by sitting,
Kalkıp kılamazsa.
if you cannot stand up for prayer, for example.
Hatta hiçbir yeri kımıldamasa bile
And even if none of your body parts is able to move,
gözleriyle namazı kılması lazım.
even then you may perform your prayers through signs with your eyes.
Şimdiki insanlar yok işte namazda şöyle oluyordu, kılamıyorum, kıldırmıyor.
And then yet people say, I cannot pray. When I pray, I'm hindered by praying. I undergo conditions which prevent me from performing my prayers.
Diyorlar, kıldırmıyor dediğin nefis kıldırmıyor.
There's nothing that prevents you from prayer except your ego.
Sen onu nefsini kıracaksın,
You need to break your ego,
o namazı kılacaksın.
and you must perform your prayer.
Başka çaresi yok.
There's no excuse and there's no other way around it.
Onu kıldıkça o dediği haller üstünden gider.
And as you perform your prayers, you will break your ego, and the conditions and state that you undergo during prayer, which make it difficult for you, will go away.
O haller kalmaz Allah'ın izniyle.
And then these states which you experience during prayer, they will no longer remain.
Mazeret farzlar için mazeret olmaz.
There cannot be an excuse for what is obligatory.
Yapamadıkları şeyleri oruç hastaysa yapamaz.
Of course, there are certain rules. For example, for fasting, you may not fast if you are sick.
Onun yerine fidyesini verir.
Instead, you may make up for it by making a donation.
Ama namazı muhakkak namazın fidyesi yani olmaz. Onu
But there's no way of making up for missing a prayer by making a donation. There's no excuse for missing a prayer.
yani dediğimiz gibi hiçbir hareket yoksa bile gözüyle konuşamıyorsa için
And even, as we said, there's no excuse. And if none of your body parts can move, still through your movements of your eyes, you may perform your prayers.
içinden okuyarak
And even if you can't say a word or are unable to speak, you may recite from within inside.
kılması lazım yani onu
And you must pray one way or the other.
yapması farzdır.
To pray 5 times a day is fard and it's an obligation.
Başkası artık onun yerine öldükten sonra Allah affetsin, ne yaparsa yapsın artık.
And if you must pray until you are dead. When you are dead, may Allah Almighty forgive, but when you're dead you may do whatever you want, but until then you have to pray.
Allah muhafaza etsin.
May Allah Almighty protect us,
Allah kolaylık versin.
and may Allah Almighty make it easy for us,
İbadet lezzeti versin.
and may Allah Almighty give us the sweet taste of worship.
İbadet kılınca bir haz duyar insan.
When you perform your worship, you will experience a sweet taste.
Bir güzellik hisseder.
You will feel a beauty.
Onu hissetmeyen onun için mazeret yapar. Allah
And those who are unable to experience that, they make excuses for not praying.
o hazı güzelliği hepimize versin o.
But if you do not experience it, you should not make it an excuse for you to not pray, but instead you should ask and pray for experiencing that sweet taste of worship.
Kalbimize nur iman olsun, ferah
May Allah Almighty enlighten our hearts and refresh our hearts with strong faith and belief.
olsun inşallah. Ferahlık, sıkıntılar onunla gider inşallah.
May Allah Almighty give refreshment to our hearts, and it is through prayer that our hearts will refresh and that the distress in our hearts will go away.
Ve minallah tevfik. El Fatiha.